Welcome to the podcast of Rogue Valley Christian Church, located in Medford, Oregon. We strive to be a people who gather together to connect the unconnected to Jesus, grow together in full devotion to God, and serve the world with Him.
If you have a Bible, you can turn to Mark chapter 14. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one underneath the seat in front of you. And as you turn to Mark chapter 14, you can find verse 26. In Mark chapter 14, verse 26, we read these words. And when they had sung a hymn, this is immediately following the Lord's Supper that we looked at last week, that Passover meal that he shared with his disciples. And in Mark chapter 14, verse 26, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised, I will go before you to Galilee." And Peter said to him, "Even though they all fall away, I will not." And Jesus said to him, "Truly, I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said the same thing. Skip ahead, if you will, to Mark chapter 14, verse 66. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus." But he denied it, verse 68, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you mean." And he went out into the gateway, and the rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him and began to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. And after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to invoke a curse upon himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." And immediately, verse 72, the rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and he wept. It's a passage in the Gospels that we're familiar with. We've read this story before. It's not uncommon for these passages to be read around Easter time. It's not uncommon for these passages to be read around Good Friday, so on and so forth. Even as we read the Gospels and understand what's going on, it's not uncommon for us to come across these passages, and specifically this story. Now, we know that at the end of the story that we just read, that Peter does deny 3 times. He does end up at the end of the passage breaking down and weeping because of everything that Jesus said would happen was happening. And in that happening, everything Peter said wouldn't happen was happening. We know also, though, that this is not the end of the story. We know that John chapter 21 is going to come. We'll get there shortly. But we also know that there were some things that were said before and in the middle of not only the prediction and the actual playing out of the denial, but we know that Jesus said some things in that gap, but he also said some things before, which I think are key to understanding everything that's going on. Everything that's going on, just the short of it, can you check on that? The short of it, everything that's going on, just so you know, is that everything that was going on is that Jesus is actually making his way to the cross, and he's going to give his life as a ransom for many. We know that process. We know that things are going to happen. We know that what he said is going to happen is going to take place. But some 2 years or so before that, in Mark chapter 8, verse 34, I think this is important to realize and to connect. Jesus said to his disciples, he said to a crowd, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Now, when we read that in Mark chapter 8, some 1.5 to 2 years earlier than the episode that we just read in Mark chapter 14, we'll jump around a little bit here. But as we read what Jesus had said some time before, we know that Mark chapter 8 is connected. When Jesus says these things, it's connected to a very specific crowd. It's the crowd that had seen him or been a part of the feeding of the 5,000. Just if we put the Gospels in chronology, we understand that's when this was being said. That Jesus, in light of that miracle and what was happening and the fallout from that miracle, Jesus is saying, wait a minute. Remember, as a result of the miracle, a lot of people were following after Jesus, but they didn't want to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. They wanted bread. Are you with me? That's what they wanted, an easier life. They thought he was the key to their best life that they could live, so to speak. And so Jesus actually looks at them at a certain point and he says, hold on. If anyone would come after me, they've got to understand what this is really all about. And he gives them an exhortation. If you want to come after me, then following me, being one of my disciples, is more than just taking my teaching upon yourself. Being one of my disciples means that you're going to live the reality of my teaching, and the reality of my teaching will be seen in a life filled with self-denial, sacrifice, and submission. If anyone would come after me, he would deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The calling card, by the way, of Christian discipleship. It should be the hallmark of our living. We should live lives that are set aside for these very purposes, that are characterized by a willingness to say, not my will, Lord, but yours be done. They're characterized by a willingness to say, even if I have to suffer, right? And even if I have to willingly embrace life as it's in its most uncomfortable forms, I will do so for your glory, Lord. Because I'm willing to go wherever you want me to go and do whatever you want me to do. I'm willing, like Nancy. Remember little Nancy? Nancy, she's just tiny. I saw her again this week. She's tiny. I really feel tall around her. Like she was like that's what it can look like. She said yes. There was a willingness for self-denial at her stage in life when you should be working towards retirement, right? You should be thinking about those things and sacrifice. Like, I'm going to sell everything and I'm going to go where I believe that you've told me to go. I'm going to follow you in that, right? That's the calling card of Christianity. But did you know a couple of weeks ago when we talked to her, did you see how her face glows with joy and for lack of a better term, joy? Like, it just bubbles up out of her. I dare you. I've seen her like 4 times in my entire life. All 4 times, it's just bubbling over joy, but she's embracing this. I only bring that up because it can be that beautiful, right? But here's the thing. Jesus doesn't just require it of us. He actually exemplifies it for us. Like, it's not as if Jesus says, hey, if you're gonna be one of my guys, you got to do something I'm not willing to do, but I want you to do it, right? I want you to do this. I'm beyond all that, but you have to do that. So now we're back into Mark chapter 14. We've read of Peter's denial. Look, Jesus looks at all of the disciples and says, you're all going to fall away. And just so you know, technically speaking, fall away. The word for fall away is connected to a passage in Zechariah, which gives you insight into a word that was used to describe people who were so afraid of what was going on with their circumstances that they scattered from that moment. Does that make sense? Like, Jesus is looking at them and he says, it's not just that he's not looking at them and saying, hey, everything's going to get tough and you're not going to believe in me anymore. What he's saying to them is, just as I've told you I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to give my life as a ransom for many, right? I'm going to die, I'm going to be betrayed and I'm going to suffer, but I'll rise again on the 3rd day. Jesus told them this, and now on the night, hours away from the reality of that taking place, he says, look, here's what's going to happen. You're all going to be scattered because they're going to strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. That's Zechariah. And the context is this. When they strike the shepherd, it is going to be so overwhelming that you will lose courage and you will run for your lives. That's literally what the falling away means, right? And the disciples, they respond. Peter's like, no, Lord, I would never, like, even if all of they do it, I wouldn't. In a sense, declaring, I'm better than them, walking on water. They didn't walk on water. I would never do that. And Jesus says to him, Peter, tonight, before the rooster, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter responds saying, no, I will not. And they all declared the same thing. Even if we have to die with you, we will not turn our backs on you. Right? We will not fall away. But then we skip a whole section on purpose. We skip a whole section. We go to the end of the passage where we read that they all scattered. All of them scattered. Even a young man who most Bible scholars believe, the young man who ran away naked. Have you ever read the Bible? Right? There's a young man that's so afraid. He runs for his life. They grab his tunic and he's like, oh, get out of here. And he runs away. It's Mark, right? They're all scattered at the end of this passage. But there's a couple of keys in the very beginning and through the middle that we have to hold on to that I think in holding on to, it puts Jesus front and center in the story. And when it puts Jesus front and center in the story, if Jesus is front and center not only in the passage and in this story, but in our service and in our life, then there's hope to be had, because I think that's the issue. Because how many of you, like me, like Peter, have been overwhelmed, afraid, worried, struggling, upset, whatever it is, and you've kind of run away a little bit? And the runaway can be for a season. Maybe you've had a decade of decadence. I don't know. Maybe you ran away for 10 years. Maybe on the other end of the spectrum, you just ran away for 10 minutes. How many of you guys know that there's a lot of negative stuff that can happen when you walk away from God in 10 minutes? Have you guys ever been there, right? 10 minutes, right? So it doesn't matter if it's 10 years or 10 minutes. We've all been in the same place. And I believe that God's got more for us than to just break down and weep with no hope. Don't get me wrong. I think if we turn our backs on Jesus, I think if we, with cursing, say that we don't know him and deny him in the most crass and brutal ways, it should break our heart. But in the breaking of our hearts, there's hope. Why is there hope? Because Mark chapter 14 communicates some things that are worthy of finding hope in. Look at first example is this. It says this, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. Verse 28 of Mark chapter 4. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. I'm not going to lie. I think we're nothing if we're not honest in the way that we approach God and in the way that we serve the Lord. And this is a part of the ways that I serve the Lord. So let me be honest with you. The very first time that I recognized that phrase in Mark chapter 14, verse 28, that after I'm raised, I'll go before you to Galilee, was this morning. Now, some of you are like, man, you need to do a better job of studying, Pastor. Totally true. However, this morning at 9 a.m. service, I read these words where he says, and I'll go before you to Galilee. Jesus says to his disciples, you're all going to be scattered. And in a sense, when he says, and after I'm raised from the dead, I'll meet you in Galilee. That's what go before you in Galilee means. It doesn't mean that I'll be in Galilee if you want to try to get back on my good side. That's not what that means at all. It says, I will go before you in Galilee. And the inference is we will meet and we will talk and we will eat breakfast there. That's what the rest of the word means there. But he says it before anything bad like crazy goes down. And in the midst of their denial, in the midst of all of that, even when he's saying, you're going to do what you say you're not going to do and what you think you won't do, I will not give up on you. I will not give up on you, he says. Now again, right? Paul would say, listen, I'm like where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And Paul celebrates the reality there's no amount of sin that can overwhelm the grace of God in Christ. And then somebody astutely asks the Apostle Paul in the scriptures, they say, well, should I sin so that grace can abound more? And Paul said, may it never be. But the reality is this, if we struggle with any kind of struggle, what we have to look back on and have hope in is the reality of Jesus told his disciples, hours before they would deny him in the worst ways, he told them hours before they would deny him, I will not give up on you. I will see you in Galilee. I will see you, check this out, Galilee. I love the Bible. I will see you in Galilee. Do you know what Galilee meant to those disciples? Galilee was the place where it all started with Jesus. It wasn't just away from Jerusalem so it's safe and they won't get us anymore. Heisman Trophy. They won't get us anymore. That's not why. Galilee, it's relational, it's intimate. Jesus says, all this is going to happen, but don't lose hope even though you're going to feel hopeless, because I'm going to meet you when it's all over in that very place that I met you the first time. And I got to believe for you and I, it doesn't mean that I have to go all the way back to that one church, that one day, on that one moment, wearing that same outfit that I came to know Jesus in. I don't think that's what it means. What it means is, wait a minute, we can go back to that one place within our hearts when we first came to know him and say, I don't know anything or even everything, but I do know that you love me. Would you help me? So then we have this whole life of experience where we blow things, right? Jesus gets to be front and center. He says, I'm going to go meet with you in Galilee. Guess what happens? It's a challenge for you and I. And I don't know where you're at. I don't know how you all come in at church. I'm starting to pick up the rhythms. Some of you come in like this. Hey, good to see everyone, right? Like that. Others come in like this. I don't want to see anyone, right? And then there's everybody within the middle of it. There's like some that you come in, you can't wait. Some of you come in, you do the same thing every single time, right? You check the same place, same bulletin, and put it in the same chair. We're going to sit in the same place every week, and nobody better take it, or there's going to be fighting to pay, right? Like, I don't know how you come in here. And I don't even know what you come in here with. But I know this, man. If you're anything like me, week after week, because life is weird and hard and frustrating and strange, week after week, I walk in with a certain amount of, I don't know, it's hard. Life, you know what I'm saying? And in the midst of that, we can find hope because Galilee's a-coming. And what I mean by that is this. For us, we look back, the resurrection has taken place, and he simply calls us back to that moment where we said, Jesus, I just need your help. Now, if I were you, I would think, okay, Darrin, how do you know all of that's true? And I would give you two reasons. One, the whole rest of Scripture seems to indicate this is exactly how God deals with his people when they have a covenant, right? When they have a covenant with the Father, meaning a commitment that's unbreakable. And just so you know, the Father has a covenant, an unbreakable covenant with you and I because of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. He has a blood covenant. So his faithfulness and hopefulness is guaranteed. The covenant is based on him keeping it, not me keeping it, because I usually don't, but he always does. Does that make sense? So that would be my one answer. And then if you were talking to me in that moment, you would have checked out because I just went all theological on you talking about blood and covenants. My other answer is this. How do I know that we can count on meeting with him in Galilee? Because it's exactly what he did with the disciples, but it wasn't cheap grace. Are you with me? See, John chapter 21 happens, doesn't it? John chapter 21 happens. We're going to get back to Mark 14. John chapter 21. Jesus is resurrected from the dead. The disciples have all gone, this group of disciples, they've all gone back to fishing because that's what they knew. And everything that they thought that their lives were going to be about was over because he died. And they've heard that he's alive and maybe even seen him, but they're not sure what all of this means anymore. And so they just, like, in the meantime, I'm going fishing. So they all go back to fishing. And one morning, they're out fishing. They've been fishing all night, according to John 21. They haven't caught a thing. And Jesus is standing on the seashore, right? And he's standing on the seashore with food cooking. Smell it, right? It's there, right? You've got the fresh, it's fantastic. And the disciples, they hear from a distance, hey! They look up. There's this man on the seashore with breakfast cooking who asks them a very interesting question. Did you catch anything? Which we read into. We're like, of course they didn't, right? Did you catch anything? And they answer the man, no, we fished all night, caught nothing. And then the guy on the seashore, who they don't recognize yet, right? The one who said he would meet them in Galilee is standing before them in Galilee, only they don't recognize him. He says, why don't you throw your nets on the other side? In the process of throwing their nets on the other side, they're like, wait a minute, we've been here before. And the nets drop into the other side. There's a huge catch. They bring it in. The boat's sinking. The nets are ripping. And Peter's like, it's the Lord! You with me? For those of you who like church to be a little bit more reverent, it iseth the Lordeth. You're welcometh. Right? It's the Lord. And Peter, we're told in John chapter 20, Peter dives into the water. He swims to meet Jesus. And he stands before them. I think he's moving faster than his brain. And he stands before them and he's soaking wet. He's like, ah! And the Lord says, well, welcome, friends. And he has breakfast with all of them. And then in John chapter 21, verse 15, he looks at Peter and he says, hey, Peter, do you love me? And the first time he asks him, do you love me more than these? Right? My suggestion is when the Lord meets us, right in that moment, it's very intimate. It's very personal. Do you love me more than these? Because I seem to recall you said you did. And then you didn't. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And feed my sheep. Peter, yeah, Lord, do you love me? Yes, Lord. You know all things. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Yes, I love you. And feed my sheep. Jesus asks Peter 3 times for 3 denials, do you love me? Feed my sheep. See, it's this absolutely beautiful fulfillment of, I will meet you after I rise again in Galilee. And when I meet you there, I will restore you there. And when I restore you there, I will use you there. And when I use you there, I will affect the world there. When I affect the world there, people will come to know me there. And when people come to know me there, I get glory there. And when people come to know me there and I get glory there, they find joy there. And when they find joy there, they have hope there. And when they have hope there, they don't give up there. All of these things happened to Peter. How do you know? Well, if you do any kind of history reading, you'll recognize Peter's life did not necessarily get all hunky-dory from then on out. In fact, it got really, really uncomfortable, but he never gave up. He never lost hope, and he was willing to actually die before denying Jesus ultimately. But how do we get there? See, John 21, I don't believe it's a picture of cheap grace. It's a picture of resurrected grace. And resurrected grace has to have a death and a burial before it's a resurrected grace. So go back to John chapter 14. You remember, I think Jesus called his disciples to do exactly what he was willing to do for them. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Look at verse 32 of Mark chapter 14. Verse 32, we actually see Jesus denying himself while in the garden at Gethsemane. And when they went to the place called Gethsemane, he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John, and he began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground, and he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And he came and he found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? And could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and he prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were weary, and they did not know how to answer him. And he came a 3rd time and he said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. If anyone wants to come after me, he must first deny himself. Jesus in the garden at Gethsemane. Have you guys seen the pictures of the Dome of the Rock Mosque in Jerusalem, the big golden covered dome, right? You guys have seen these pictures. Somebody nod. Yes? Seen these pictures. Most of the time when we see a picture of that, that picture is taken from the Mount of Olives, close to the Garden of Gethsemane, where they believe that was. So that's that perspective, right? That's what they could see. They could see the city, and they're up on this, across the Kidron Valley area, out of the way, and Jesus is in that garden praying. And he prays 3 different times. Lord, Father, Abba. Just so you know, he uses the term Abba, which is a very intimate term for father. It's the equivalent would be daddy, right? It's not a term, we've all heard this before, but that's not a term that any of the good Jewish men would have used. It was too familiar of a term to be used with God, but Jesus uses it. And he says, if it's possible, right, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. The cup, by the way, Old Testament, Jesus uses Old Testament imagery language to describe a cup that would contain something. It's a cup containing, just as a cup would contain wine, just as a cup would contain water, this cup that Jesus is praying about in the garden is containing the whole of humanity's sin. Are you with me? The whole of humanity's sin, and then on top of that is all of God's judgment for that sin. Like, Lord, if it's possible, if there's another way than my having the weight of humanity's sin and your judgment come upon me, if there's another way, can we do it another way? Jesus prays. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. If anyone, Jesus said to his disciples, would come after me, let them deny themselves. This is exactly what Jesus is doing. He's being honest with the Father in the most intimate way, saying, if there's another way, let's do that. Nevertheless, I trust you. I will not forsake you. I will hold on to you. I will allow you to be you and me to be me in this mysterious Godhead relationship. I think that's the issue, right, for us, right? As we see Jesus practicing in the garden a prayer of self-denial. That it begins with us recognizing that we have to trust God because it may not make sense to us. We have to trust God, and we have to let God be God, and we have to understand that God's big, profound purposes and plans are probably more important than our microcosms of wants and desires. Does that make sense? I'll be honest with you. It doesn't make self-denial any less difficult. But it does make what Jesus did so much more profound. He doesn't just require something of us that he's not willing to do. He's asking us to do what he himself did. But he also said, if anyone comes after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. Look at chapter 14, verse 43. And immediately, we'll back up to 41. And he came to them a third time, and he said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Let us be going. I'm going to walk right into the Father's will. Look at what happens. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came. And with him came a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard. And when he came up, he went to Jesus at once and said, Rabbi, and he kissed him. We've all read it, and we all know it. We all know this is what happened. But it's worthwhile to take a minute and let its weight burden us a little. Like for us, it's relationally unforgivable, isn't it? I mean, we don't let anybody treat us that way, do we? Somebody to pretend that they're really a close, intimate friend, and all the while stabs us in the back. My experience is that when that happens to most people write that person off. At best. At worst, they beat them up. Right? Wars have been started over less. And Jesus willingly accepts it. Because of the Father's plan to make everything that went wrong in the garden, not the Gethsemane, but the original garden, right again for eternity. He willingly embraces it. Matthew tells us that he willingly embraces it personally. Because when Judas comes up to us, Matthew tells us that he looks at him and he said, friend, do what you came to do. And it's no stretch to believe that he embraces it because God so loved the world, which is you and me, that we might not die eternally for our sins, but have forgiveness because he took up his cross. He embraces it. Well, look at what happens. And they laid hands on him and they seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. It's so real, it's ridiculous, actually. Like, this is all going on. The disciples at this point still are clueless as to what Jesus is doing. And so one of the disciples, in the split second, decides, this is probably my best course of action, is to wield a sword that I've had no training wielding. We know, the book of John, book of Luke tells us that the disciple who pulled the sword and struck the servant's ear, we know that that was Peter. Remember, Peter was a professional fisherman, not a soldier. How do I know? Well, in this moment that was super intense, Peter's intention with the sword is to lop off his head, not his ear. Right? But he's not a very good sword, like he's just not. He would have been, I said this first service, and I gotta. Like, he would have been better if he probably would have had more luck if he would have had his fishing net strapped to his side and just netted the guy. But instead, he's like, I will protect you, Lord. Blah! And Malchus, who we're told in the other Gospels that that's what his servant's name was, Malchus does this. And he just gets the ear when it should have been the whole, right? And then Peter is standing there going, probably with the sword, blood dripping, an ear part on the ground. How much of an ear part we're not told. But an ear part on the ground, little blood going on there. Peter's like, didn't go how I thought. And we know that according to the other Gospels, Jesus actually stops it all, picks up the ear part, heals the servant's ear, and tells Peter, put your sword away. Because those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And in so saying, he's like, my kingdom doesn't work that way. What I have to do, Peter, that you don't understand, is I have to take up my cross. See, Peter tries to fight the way we try to fight, doesn't he? In hopes that God will answer his force with more force. Like, in one sense, you could understand Peter thinking, well, I don't know how to quite use it, but Jesus is in my corner, so, right? Hoping that Jesus at that point would say, legions, now! And there'd be this big overthrowing, and there wouldn't have to be a cross, and all would be happily ever after. But the problem with life is this. Without the cross and the resurrection, there is no happily ever after. Why? Because that's the way God intended it to be all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. I didn't mean for those words to rhyme, but man, I'm going to start rapping. On my spare time. Like, that's what God is doing. You see, we just read stories and details and we're like, ooh, ears, blood, accidents. Oh, Jesus is good. Like the Sunday school lesson was, when you make a mess of your life, when you make a mess of your life, when you make a mess, when you make a mess, when you make a mess with your life, with the knife, God can put your ear back on your head. God, will you guys use that song next time you come to that passage in Sunday school? For the record, I made it up on the spot, told you, rapper. Didn't happen first service, did it? Right? So we read it and we think, well, that's what it's all about. You know what? It's not. It's connected to deep, huge theological implications. And the biggest of which is Jesus said to those followers all those years later, if you want to follow me, if you want to come after me, you have to take up your cross. You have to deny yourself and take up your cross. And he did. Like, this whole passage is communicating that nothing would stop Jesus from embracing the cross on behalf of humanity. Nothing would stop him from embracing the cross so that the cup of humanity's sins and God's wrath could be poured out to its fullest and in its completion, that we might sit here this morning in complete safety because the blood of Jesus has forgiven us of all of our iniquities. It's that important, but it doesn't come by some servant's accidental ear hacking off. It comes from Jesus' very purposed intention of giving his life as a ransom for many. Jesus continues, he says, day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled. I will embrace the cross, just as my Father has said it should be so, according to Isaiah, according to Jeremiah, according to Zechariah, according to Genesis, according to the whole of the book. I will do what I'm supposed to do. You see, here's the thing. When Jesus takes center stage in the story, it affects us more than if we just believe that it's me, right? Then it's just like somehow I want to be the main character, but I'm not. Like it's Jesus. But he said to those disciples in Mark chapter 8, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Okay, this one gets really cool, just so you know. Verse 53. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. Now, you know, if you put together all the Gospels, right, that Jesus was led before a number of different courts at a number of different times. Jewish courts, Roman courts, all the courts over this span of a few hours. And you also know that according to the rules and regulations of court meetings in the Jewish culture, some of those courts that he was in front of were not, quote unquote, legal. I'm not here to get into all of that. I'm just simply here to finish up the book of Mark. Amen? And that came out wrong. But in the book of Mark, we're simply told that he was brought before them. And look at what happens. It says this, and Peter, verse 54, followed at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. And this is what he witnessed. As he was sitting with the guards warming himself at the fire, the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death. But they found none, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that was made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. So Peter is witnessing. He's watching Jesus before the courts, and he's watching the courts bring in liar after liar, confused person after confused person after confused person to condemn him to death. To no success, but look at what happens, right? And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, Caiaphas stands up. Okay, that's it. I've had enough, he says. And he asked Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But he remained silent and made no answer. Jesus, listen, I think this is a really cool side note example. Jesus didn't see it was necessary at all to answer liars who were making up stories about him. So he just doesn't say anything. And yet we got to go to his rescue and our own if somebody lies about us. You know what? A lie is a lie is a lie is a lie. It's going to be a lie. We don't have to prove that it's a lie by speaking more truth, right? You just get into these crazy little debates, both spiritually and personally. Look, if you want to go, honestly, if you want to go out the door and make up lies about me or anybody else in here, then go do that. I'm telling you, I'm not going to answer them. I've done that enough, and I've got beaten up in the process way more times than it was worth. I just want to do what Jesus did. I'm just going to keep entrusting myself to the Father of truth, and know that I live a life that is integrity, right? That's what we do. And then look at what happens. He just says nothing. And again, the high priest asked him, finally, he goes, okay, fine. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Now, just so you know, the easy answer was yes. It is as you say. That's the easy answer. But that's not what Jesus said. Remember, if anyone wants to come after me, they must deny themselves, take up the cross, follow me. Follow me as I follow the Father. Look at what Jesus does. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And in verse 62, Jesus said, I am. In our culture, that doesn't mean much. It's two words, I and am. In their culture, well, I'll just look at what else Jesus says. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds in heaven. Look at what happens. Verse 63. Here's where we understand what it meant in their culture. And the high priest tore his garments and said, what further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. See, remember when Moses was approached by God in a burning bush. And at some point Moses says, Wait a minute. You want me to go and do what? When I go and do this, nobody's going to believe me. Who is it that, who do I tell them has sent me? And God answers it. You tell them, I am has sent you. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. Jesus claims, I am God in the flesh. And they knew it. They knew what he was saying. Why? Because the high priest, he responds in a way that indicated that somebody just spoke the worst words of blasphemy that a Jewish man could speak, and that was claiming to be God. And he rips his clothes, and he says, what more proof do we need? Put him to death. See, here's the interesting thing. We've got this process where Jesus has denied himself. He's willing to take up his cross, and he is following the footsteps of the Father. He is not deviating at all from the Father's plan to accomplish the Father's will all the way through. And they all condemned him as deserving of death. Look at this. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying, prophesy. And the guards received him with blows. While in front of the Sanhedrin, Jesus calmly and confidently followed the will of the Father, even in the face of humiliation and torture. Peter himself will say these words later on in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. My suggestion in this passage is this, that we come to this conclusion. Jesus is our hero, and he's worthy of our worship, because as our hero, he has not only remained faithful even when we were unfaithful, but in his resurrection that he promises, in that Galilean reunion, so to speak, he guarantees